Okay, so this is a panel topic that could literally take 2 hours. And part of the reason why is because there is no one definitive way to create an RPG. There are a lot of phases to RPGs which are very similar across the board, but how those different phases are completed change depending upon the size of the company, the budget that they have, money to make the RPG, pay the freelancers, pay the artists. Also, printing and distributing the RPG is also very different. So we're going to go through some of the phases, and I'm going to talk about some of the options. I'm going to go until about 11:30, and then at that time I'm going to start turning it over to questions so we can get into some specifics that you want to know about. I am not somebody that likes to talk about the work that I do, in the sense that I've done a lot and I don't like to overwhelm people, but I have worked for multiple companies. I was the marketing director for Steve Jackson Games, so I've worked on board games, card games from a marketing sense. I have worked on card games from a design perspective as well. Those have never come out. And then I've also worked on a lot of tabletop RPGs and also stories that are set in those worlds. So my experience in the tabletop industry is kind of broad. So if you feel that you have very, you feel that your question is very, words can't word this morning. If you feel that you have a very minutia question or you feel that it's very difficult, feel free to ask me anyway. I've been around in the industry since about 2005, so between the stuff that I've done and other people have done, it's kind of easy for me to pop into that mode. Okay, here's the first thing about a game. Oh my gosh, you want to create a game. Then what, right? There are many different ways to approach that first phase. I usually think of it as brainstorming, where you and either a team or one other person collaborate to figure out what is the core premise of your game. During this phase, I think there are 2 very important questions that if you answer these questions in the brainstorming phase, the rest of the game design process will go a lot smoother. That is unique to my style. What I like to ask is, what does an individual player do at the table? And what do the players do as a group? And why does that matter? Because in an age where we have very expansive settings, I'm a big fan of Ravenloft. There's also Dragonlance. We've got all of the Paizo very detailed settings. We have Vampire the Masquerade, etc. When you create a game, whether it's a full core book or a campaign setting or an adventure, if you don't know the core premise to those questions, what tends to happen is you lose focus because you might get caught up in how you like to play the game, or you start thinking naturally about how other people you know start to play the game. And that is a very organic, very natural process to happen. So coming up with those 2 answers will not only help you at the beginning of your process, it will also happen towards the end. And the reason why is because once you know what the players do, everything, all of the words that you write end up pushing towards that goal. Now, they can accomplish what they do in different ways, and that's where the playing styles come in. But the core of what they do has to be very simple. 1 or 2 sentences. If you think about movies, this might be the elevator pitch. But it doesn't have to come before the brainstorming. In fact, I think it evolves after the brainstorming. Part of it is because there are many different RPGs out there already. So if you are trying to be unique in what your game does and what the setting is going to be like, that allows you to apply those questions to other games. So for example, what do people normally do as a group when they play Dungeons and Dragons? Anybody tell me? I'm looking at you, but I don't want to pick on you. Go ahead. The lady in the purple? No, right next to you. 2 people down in the same row. You raised your hand. So yeah, so basically the purpose of Dungeons and Dragons is to beat up the monsters and get treasure, right? So that is very, and that is throughout every single D&D game. And you knew that because the game is very focused and very centralized and very tight. So if you want to turn the microphone on, do you have a favorite game yourself?
Do I have a favorite game myself? Ooh, that's a bit of a hard question. I've had some fairly bad experiences in my time with LARP and with role-playing games in general. We played Vampire the Masquerade, and it tended to always go into an endless circle of romance and like relationship drama, no matter how we started.
Okay, so that is a really good example of, in that game, what do the players do and what you wanted to do were at odds with each other.
Yes.
Because what the players want, if a bunch of players want to get together and tell vampire romance stories, and you want to bite people or use blood magic or...
The interesting part was that we always talked about it before, and we were like, no, this time we're going to do something different. And then it ended up like this.
Thank you very much for that. But from a game design perspective, and I'm glad you brought that up, because from a game design perspective, here's the scariest thing I'm going to tell you all morning. You can't control what the players do once you design your game. You can't. You can think about every single possible way of putting in the language, this is how you play my game, and the players will still do whatever the heck they want with it. That's just how it works. That's just how it works. We'll get to more questions at the end. I want to keep going because I have a lot of knowledge I want to share, and then we'll make sure we do that. But that is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So during the brainstorming phase, this is what sometimes it's a battle of motivation or a battle of ego, because a lot of people in the brainstorming phase are very passionate about what they want to do. And when you're very passionate about what you want to do, you put forth these ideas. And I personally feel it's okay, if you're comfortable with the people in the group, to be able to argue about it. I hear that's something that Finns like to do a lot, which is good for game design, because being challenged by your ideas, some of the best stuff can come out of it. Right? Because then it takes and it twists it a little bit, so you come up with those two answers. So now that you have those answers, now comes the hard part. Now you actually have to do the work. I will say, just like there is always somebody that you know that is going to be working on their novel for 20 years, there are people that are going to be working on their game for 20 years, because the brainstorming part is a lot of fun, and ideas can evolve. But at some point, whoever is the lead on that team needs to be able to say, okay, we have answered what we want to do with this game, now we have to get to work. And the reason why you do that is because how you answer those questions is not going to evolve much, if any, further in the brainstorming sessions. Because once you get sold an idea, it's going to evolve when you actually put the words down. You might change the questions, or you might change the premise of your game if you continue to brainstorm, but there is definitely a point of no return. And part of the reason why that's important to know is because if you want to produce an RPG from scratch, for brand new systems, it usually takes, I want to say 12 to 18 months, depending upon the system, because you have to do a lot of playtesting, and I'll get to that in a bit. If it's an existing system, it can be somewhere between 6 months to a year, depending upon how that shakes out. So there's a lot of time involved to produce a game that goes far beyond the brainstorming session. So you have your answers, you have the brainstorming session, then you start figuring out the work. So the first question is, what systems do you use? If it's your own system, you tack on an extra, generously, I would say 6 months. 6 months to a year is generally very good for new systems, provided you have players that can play out your system. It's much easier to design a game for existing systems because people know the rules. They know how to, interact with those rules and roll dice and whatnot. So when you have that, generally speaking, what you put together is how I want this game to look like. And that is where you start getting into the outline of the project. You also come up with things like the style guide, how you want certain terms to work. So, for example, what are fairies in your game called? What are cyborgs in your game called? Place settings, etc. You come up with all of so kind of this is how I want this game to start thinking about and signing. So basically at that point I would talk to, you would have somebody that would be very invested in the setting, or it could just be the lead developer. And I like to pull them in early because as the writing goes, if you go through 3 drafts, and we'll get to that in just a second, and the writers for 3 drafts have been writing it with not using the correct terms, it's a lot of work for whoever is on the back end to do all the fixes for that. So I tend to take a very upfront approach. So I have a style guide. Some companies use them, some don't. I prefer to use them. It's called an SRD, or a system reference document. And what the system reference document is, it's the rules without all of the game content attached. So it's just the basic rules as you would explain them in just a rules setting. So there's no flavor, there's nothing wrapping around it. It's just, when you roll initiative, this is what you roll. When you roll dice, this is what you roll. And it goes through all of the rules in one reference document. Very, very helpful for writers when they're working on your game. Hugely helpful. So you have the SRD, and you have the style guide, and then you have to think about the outline. I would say that the outline is the hardest part, because in the outline phase, if you don't have experience making a game, what you are doing is you are looking at all of the other games that you've ever played or read. And you are seeing what you like and what you didn't like about those games and analyzing them from a production perspective, because you are going to replicate their process in order to make a game. And I know that's super scary, because it really is when you do it for the first time, because there's 1,000 things that can go wrong. But there's a lot of questions you have to ask yourself, right? Where do I want character creation to go? How many different types of character creation do I have? How many characters do I want in my book? What is my, when you answered what did the players do at the table, as a group, where do they play? How do I want to present that setting? I am not a big fan of the terms crunch and fluff. Some designers use them. I personally despise them. I tend to think of the rules as the engine for the game, because it makes the game go, and the setting is the vehicle. So the setting is kind of wraps around the rules, and really good game design integrates both of them so that it feels like you're in this experience, and it's very hard to, some players do all the time, but it's very hard to strip it out and not make it still feel like that game. So when I think about engine and vehicle, there's many different ways to present that vehicle, that setting. Some people like to do it using fiction. Some people like to do it using quotes. Some people like to do, they're called in-universe artifacts, like letters between characters, or take photography, photos, or illustrations. There's all different kinds of things that are very, very fascinating and interesting about that. So now you have, at the end of this process, what you should have is, here's chapter 1. These are the things that I want in my chapter. Here's chapter 2. So it's a very rough sketch. And then you start to get into word count. Word count for game design and also to fiction essentially wraps how the budget is going to work. Because writers in game design typically get paid per word, and that word rate will vary depending upon the project. This is where we start to get into the money aspect of what your game is going to be, and part of the reason why it's so important to have a budget up front. So an experienced writer who takes, say they take an 8 cents a word rate. Wizards of the Coast and Paizo are very well-established companies. Their budgets tend to be a little bit bigger, so they do pay a little bit more in terms of their rate per word, but some also pay based on experience. So say that you get 8 cents a word. Well, you are a different expense than a brand new writer that might get paid 4 cents a word. I mean, that's a 50% difference per word. So when you get to the hiring phase, you're going to see how that budget shakes out, but you still have to plan how many words per chapter ahead of time, so that what you don't want is, I'm going to send this writer, I'm going to invite them to work on my game. I have all the proper materials to do so. We'll get to that in a minute, what those are. And then they go ahead, and it's called overwriting, where they write extra words than what they were assigned. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I can't afford you, because they went over the budget. So it's very important to have clear instructions up front. Clear instructions will help prevent you a lot of pain. So once you have your rough chapter outlines, what you're going to do is you're going to start looking at how many words per chapter. Introductory chapters tend to be about 5,000 words. This is a general guideline. The most chapter lengths are, I would say, between 10 to 15, 20 on the long side. Usually 20,000 words chapters are for if there's a lot of rules involved. Sometimes if there's things like merits, flaws, and other sorts of fiddly bit traits, that's when the chapter length tends to expand. I use, in my writing, it's a little bit of a repetitious style in my chapters, because of this thing called the internet. Unfortunately, people don't read as closely as they used to. The average, I don't know how it is here, but in the States, it's 3 seconds per web page, and then people lose interest and they click it off. So I have to get really specific and to the point. I don't want to wander unless the type of game that I'm creating, that's part of the field that I'm going for. Like, I write very differently when I work on Vampire the Masquerade than I do for some of my other stuff, because Vampire the Masquerade is, it's this very intense experience. But for some of my other games like Dungeons and Dragons, I don't write like that at all. I write very blunt, to the point. I fill everything with, bum, 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 bum. I just go as fast as I can. So that is very important to your word count. So most games, the Chronicles of Darkness rulebooks, the 2nd edition rulebooks, for example, are 200,000 words, generally speaking. That's the guideline that we go for. I would say that 150 to 200,000 words for a robust system is a good target to shoot for. Some indie press, small press games, they are far shorter than that. Fiasco is a good example of a small press game. There's also Apocalypse World and some of the other ones. The less robust the rules, the simpler the game. Generally, the smaller the game is and the less writing is involved. But again, sometimes the size of your project is going to depend upon how much money you have to spend. Some writers, when they first start out, they write it themselves. I agree and disagree with that, which I'll get to in a second. So now that you have your outline, you're going to hire your writers. Generally, there is a couple of phases. So you have the here are all my instructions phase. You give them the outline, the style guide, and the SRD. And then they do first drafts. The first drafts come back. I always say that your first drafts can be terrible, because nobody should be expected to be perfect on the first try. And then you will work with them in a redline phase as the developer, so they develop their drafts. Now, here's the thing that's really fascinating about all of this. What happens is, in between redlines and first drafts, you have almost this bubble of perspective issue, because each individual writer is only going off the instructions that you give them. And you, as the developer, part of the reason why it's so important to separate the two is because you're seeing the whole book. So when you see the whole book, you're going to see how all of these pieces fit together. And that's part of the reason why the developer coordinates all of that material, but also the feedback. So a lot of writers are very invested in doing a very good job. So sometimes it doesn't matter how specific your outline gets. Sometimes they will maybe veer off a little course or do something fascinating that you hadn't thought of. It happens a lot. That's part of the reason why you have multiple drafts, is because you have to work with the writers to get the drafts to where they need to be. So you give them comments, and then they do second drafts. The second drafts come back, and you either accept it or you throw it back for third drafts. Third drafts, I would say, are fairly unusual, and they tend to be a time sink. I generally only go for 2 drafts, because by the time the third drafts come around, the writer is starting to lose money because they get paid per word. So every time they touch that document and make those revisions, that prevents them from working on other projects. And that's how a lot of freelance writers think, because we make money not on getting a salary, but by the projects that we turn in, and on time, hopefully. So by the time you're through that, now you're to the developed drafts. Now the developed drafts is where you take all of these manuscripts and you put them together. And when you put them together, you have the full manuscript for the book, right? No. You don't. The reason why is because you are going to be creating a template for a layout designer and an editor to work with so that they can take it off and do their magic. So you are going to develop the drafts so it sounds very similarly, that all, like if rules in chapter 1 are very similar to rules in chapter 4, you have to go through all of these pieces. There are some game lines that have what are known as rules editors. Personally, I really like having rules editors when I work with them, because rules editors very specifically only look at the rules. And I feel it's just like a second insurance policy to make sure they're correct. I feel the rules are very important for that reason. So we go through all of that. And when you get the developed draft, then it goes to an editor. And the editor is not the developer of the project. In some cases, there are processes in place where the editor does some developer work. I personally don't prefer that. I like the editor to look at the language. This is going to be somebody that looks at the language. They look at the style guide. They put all of these things together to try to figure out how they're going to go. So once the editor does all of those pieces, you get it back, and then you as the developer get to accept or deny those changes, as you know, because you're the authority. So the editorial process in that phase, once you get it back, you are then preparing your manuscript for layout. Now, this part is very fascinating from a visual standpoint, because in Microsoft Word or in word processors software, you write down, right? You write down this way. So most first-time game designers, the people that are working down on a book, will think that the layout is going to go down this way. But the layout doesn't look like that. The layout looks like this, right? But the layout looks like this also in a different software program. So a lot of times, without realizing it, people will start designing what those pages look like, and they'll do the first version where they start adding these sidebars because they think that's where it's going to fit on the page. This is a very common problem. It happens a lot. Here's my advice to handle this problem. When you get to the outline phase, way back in the beginning, what you do is, if you have the money for it, or if you know somebody who does layout design, you say, I need help establishing a template for this game so I know how many words fit on a page. Okay. When the words fit on, how many words fit on the page, it can be anywhere from 300 to 1,000. Generally speaking, I like to shoot for 500 to 750 with art. That also determines your art budget. It also determines things like sidebars. There's a tendency to throw in a lot of sidebars in the text, unfortunately. Sometimes you could get chapters back that has more sidebars than actual text, because people love sidebars. Here's this additional thing that I was thinking about, and I want to put this over here. So I like to set limits on that personally, and try to rein them back in. It's very difficult for the layout artist to lay out 10 sidebars and maybe 1,000 words of text, because it's just going to look like Tetris, and that game already exists, right? But what you do in that editorial phase is that person will also check it when they check it against the style guide if there's any very technical layout templates. A lot of gaming companies use templates based on Microsoft Word that essentially have the styles built in, so the headers are one way and the body text is another. And the reason why this is the case is because when it gets translated over into a layout software, all of the text is correct. So if you start adding in things like extra returns or tabs or indents that weren't part of the original style guide, it really makes your layout person's life a living hell. Can I say hell? It does. It makes their life very challenging. So so once you get to the layout phase, your game is then being laid out, and I personally feel you should be very kind to your layout artists, because you want them to be happy with you so that they will do more things. So they will come up with this template, which will inform you what art you need to do, and you will generally try to keep it to 2 or 3 rounds of proofing. By proofing, I mean they lay out the whole thing. You will get a PDF, an electronic version of your game, and you will be shocked because it will be beautiful, and then it will come back, and that's when you have to start making comments on where the errors, because sometimes there is text to layout errors that happen very organically through the software problems. And then once that's done, then they do all of their magic to either make it a digital book or a print book file. There are 2 different types of files. In some cases, there's existing templates that you can use that are very simple, like on DM's Guild and the community created content. Those templates you really don't have to think about. Generally speaking, people just write in those templates so they don't have to go through the layout process or anything like that. So that is the production cycle of a game. I'm sure you can see why it takes a long period of time, because there's all of these different people involved. Those phases change dramatically depending upon the size of the company, the budget for the arts, and also how long it takes for different people to write different things. So with that in mind, I want to pause here and ask if there are any questions, because I have talked to you and many of you are looking at me with like glassy eyes. Okay. Okay, so red lines are where if you, like an editorial, if you remember like editors joking about the big red pen that goes up so they can mark on the document, what red lines are is this is the part where you get to be very brutal. You're not being brutal to the person, you're being brutal to the manuscript. It's 2 very different things. So there are many different styles to give red lines. I like to, and have learned, I need to use a lot of smiley faces when I do it. Most professional writers that have been doing it for a while will internalize that any comments are not against them personally, that it's against the manuscript. But it's very scary if you're just starting out and you're getting red lines for the first time, because you're like, oh no, there's all of these comments on my work, I don't know what to do, or I get overwhelmed. And what you want to do, what I want to do is I want to empower my writers to feel very excited. So I have to add lots of smiley faces. Any other questions? I mean, there's a lot of material here. Do you have questions?
Yeah. I have actually several, but let's start with first. When I first started, I went to learn different types of programs like Adobe InDesign, so I know how the layout works. And when I started working with artists, I noticed that I couldn't communicate my idea as well as I can now. So I had to learn a little bit of Photoshop and stuff like that, how it works. Because, but how is your experience? Is it better to ask advice from someone who knows and have them to do it, or do you prefer to learn yourself?
Okay, so let's go over art notes.
Yeah.
Okay, so how many of you have ever had a vision in your head that you couldn't tell somebody about what it looked like? Okay, look at all of these people. Okay, this happens all the time. What happens with art notes is that you are visualizing something, and because you don't work in art all the time, and your natural instinct is to learn these programs, that is not a requirement. What you have to do for art notes is relay the things that are in your head to the person that has the experience in the software so they can make the thing that you're thinking of. There's a way to practice this. It's very silly. It's incredibly silly, but it works. And you can go to any museum website, pick a random painting, and then try to describe the painting. And as you describe the painting, you want to get all of the details. You want to get race. You want to get, it depends. Artists really love it when you're specific. They also like it if they have a little bit of flexibility in terms of style. Usually a lot of artists are commissioned based on their style because they're adding something unique to the project. So hopefully you would know that before you hire them. So you describe these paintings, okay? So, well, everybody here knows the Mona Lisa, so let's just go with that. So the Mona Lisa painting is a portrait. So you would say, first word, portrait. And you would give them the size. You would have to tell them the size. Very, very important. Never not tell an artist the size, because they will come back to you and say, what am I supposed to make? So first thing, portrait. Then you go through the description, the skin color, the hair color, if it's important to your character, okay? This is part of the reason why you want to think about art notes not necessarily in your outline phase, but after your first drafts come back, because you're going to have descriptions of characters that you may want to be illustrated. So some of that information needs to be pulled out for the artists. And depending upon where you are in your budgeting cycle, you may want to get the artist started early. I usually think it's really good to wait until after it comes back from editing, because then that's kind of like, okay, there's going to be no more significant changes. That way you can't the natural inclination is to tinker and make changes. But once you're done making changes, that's a really good spot to make art notes. But the other things that are very interesting is things like clothes. What does the Mona Lisa wear? So for a historical character like her, you would have to find reference, and you would say, and it's very easy to do this on Wikipedia. There's a lot of historic costuming sites. Love them. You provide links of those images, and you say something like this, so that the artist has a reference. Because when they are doing their poses, you are trusting them to be the expert. What they need is that general sides of the box. Here are the sides of the box. These are the traits of the character. This is what position I would like them in. Here are some details about the background. Do your magic. I personally feel that bad art notes are one of two different things. They are either so generic, the artist is basically just guessing, and they are coming up with sketches, and you're like, I'm not going to say anything because I just want them to do their thing. And by the time the finished piece comes back, you're like, oh, that's not what I ever wanted. So most professional artists will do sketches first. That is a way to protect the artist. And yes, you should comment on sketches. But the second type of art note that I personally do not prefer is something that's so overly specific that you're basically just not trusting the artist to do their thing. You hire people based on the talent and the quality that they have, and by giving them overly specific art notes, and I have seen everything, right? Like, oh my gosh, their elbow is too high, or oh my gosh, they are squinting at the wrong way, or whatever. And I'm like, no. I mean, you need to be able to just kind of get it in that ballpark. So, art notes, did that work for everybody? Yes? Any other questions? No? Okay. And then did anybody else have any questions, or did you want to ask another one? If this is useful for people. Go ahead. It's okay.
Okay. Let's see. For me, I started designing my own thing like 2 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I think how do you feel about, because I gotten like two different advice from different people.
Okay.
I just want to know your because some people want to do like the full book in on the others they suggest that you like split it in small parts.
Okay.
And then like release like a race description or two races at one time or one
Okay.
class.
All right. So now we're getting into product.
Yeah.
First of all, before we get into product, is everybody cool if we start going into the direction of talking more about the monies? Is that cool? Okay, everybody's okay with that. All right, I just want to make sure.
Question about all-round comments on art and art direction.
Yep. Could you please hand him the microphone for me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Nope, that's okay. I just want to make sure I hear you.
Okay, yeah. My question
Thank you.
or comment is about art direction and commissioning art. How do you feel about the rights to art? Because that's one thing that when you're planning a game, if you're not a major publisher, that's a huge thing. If you want to buy all the rights to the art, or are you just buying the use for that one?
That's a very good question. There are many different ways to approach that. Everybody that you hire, regardless of who they are, needs to have a contract, first of all, right? Everybody needs to have a contract. For the art, I am very pro artist rights. I feel that the smart thing to do for artists, especially if you're small press and cannot afford to pay them thousands of dollars, is to say, I would like first-time publication rights. And then first-time publication rights means their piece is printed in your book. And then after a period that you set, usually it's about a year, they are then free to resell that art or use it in their own portfolio or be able to make more money off of it. Most of the work in the gaming industry is done as what's known as work for hire. But the longer, and this is something that I'm finding out myself, for people that have long-term careers, that means they don't own anything they work on. And for artists, that's just disastrous. So I personally, this is not how a lot of companies are structured, but I personally feel that if you are small press and in the position to do so, first-time publication rights also allows you to get higher quality artists, because then an artist might be, you know what? This sounds fun. I'm really interested in working on this, because sometimes people, when they take a job, they don't necessarily just do it for the money. There's a lot of different factors, right? If they're very interested in something, if they want to play with something. A really good example of this, I have a friend, her name is Echo Chernik. So Echo Chernik does not have to, she is a very successful artist, and she does not have to work on role-playing games. But she loves Shadowrun, so she does all these really cool art pieces for Shadowrun. And she's an example of somebody that, she does it because she loves it. That's not everybody's in that position, but first-time publication right is also friendly towards newer and upper-coming artists who are trying to get their portfolio out there, but maybe can't do it as much. But it also depends upon how you want to arrange that, because like first-time publication rights could be from the date of the publication rather than the sale. So when the game comes out, then you think about what period before that piece appears in a different book. For cover art, I think it's a different story. Cover art is very specific to your game. Same thing with things like logos, symbols, etc. So for those, I would not go maybe the traditional artist route, but maybe think about a graphic designer, because some graphic designers are very familiar with creating logos, and those are not things that they can resell. So sometimes the decisions about what types of art you have in the book can also be fueled by how you can afford the artist or figure out what the rights are. So did that help?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. All right. Any other questions before we get into the monies? Okay, so there's a lot of questions about what is the best game to make, and how long should it be? What size should it be? Some people like 6x9, some people like 8x12. The best selling game, the 800-pound, we call it the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Sorry, apparently my water cap decided to leave the building. Is still Dungeons and Dragons. It outsells everything else. Dungeons and Dragons is usually people's first experience with RPGs as well. So that is their frame of reference. And as people get more into the hobby, they're going to pick up different games, and those games are going to be their frame of reference. So, but Dungeons and Dragons is also produced in a specific style, in the sense that it has a specific purpose, like you mentioned earlier. It also has a specific format, and you can see that very similarly to other game lines that use that system, like either use 5th edition or all of the, the D20 books had a specific look, the D20 modern books had a specific look. So some of it is about what type of game you're producing. There was a game that was a recent, very odd success in the sense that it was a game that had no art, and the gentleman used YouTube videos for a while, and all he did was talk about game design, and then when he released his game, it was on index cards in a PDF. And it's one of the top selling games on Drive-Thru RPG, which is the 800-pound gorilla for buying games online. I don't think there's one way to produce a game. What I do know from my experiences is that the core book is going to be the best selling thing that you have. Then from there, it depends upon usage and investment. Every time a supplement comes out, if people aren't really invested in it, those sales tend to drop. In RPGs, it can be 50 to 75%. It depends upon the type of supplement that it is. However, it also depends upon the popularity of the rules. It is very difficult in this environment of saturation with Kickstarter and Patreon and crowdfunding to create a brand new rule system, get the playtesters required, get the people interested in it, and also create a game out of it. So a lot of first-time game designers do things like create community content, or which is brand new, somewhat in the last year or so. And they also use existing systems with what's known as an open license. So Savage Worlds is a really good example of that. D&D, the OGL when it was around. Those sorts of abilities to piggyback off of those core books really helps you, because then what you're doing is you're creating an experience based on an existing system everybody knows. It's very challenging to create your own rules right now. I'm not going to say that it can't be done. There is a convention called Metatopia, which takes place every year, where a bunch of game designers, it is based in the States. I think it's in New York or New Jersey, where a bunch of people get together and they rip apart each other's games. I mean, we like to create new systems and tinker all the time. But the challenge is, how do you get regular players and fans to invest in it? This is where things like open development comes into play, using new media, YouTube videos, blogging, Instagram, etc., to get people invested in it. But you're also, again, competing in a heavily saturated market. So if you do something like that, you have to release content on a regular basis. Otherwise, people aren't going to be invested in that. It is much easier to work on something like World of Darkness, where there's an existing fan base, versus if I just created my own game out of scratch. However, when I go that route, I know enough about the different processes and whatnot that I can kind of streamline my process so it's not as much of a risk. Which is why, if you can get even just a few freelance writing assignments, it's very educational on how those processes work, so you can apply that to your own game. I am a big proponent of making your own game. Again, the question is going to be, like, what do you want to do with the rules, really? Because there's a lot of room to make new rules, especially in LARP and diceless systems, etc. But you also need to have player buy-in. If making money is your goal. And that's very interesting in and of itself. So every retail site, just to let you know online, all of the sales look like this, okay? All of the sales. Every single site on the internet looks like this. There is the top products that kind of go here, and then there's this kind of middle part where you hope you want to be, and then this is called the long tail. So all of these products that come out, like the self-published stories and whatnot on Amazon, the average number of self-published copies is 100. So if you start adding up how much money you make on that, you can see that the work that you put in might not match the reality. So it really depends upon what your goals are and how much you want to put it out. Card games and board games are a little bit different. The board game market is very saturated right now thanks to Kickstarter. There are some amazing, amazing miniatures and beautiful, beautiful stuff that's come out. But because there is so much stuff out, it's crowding the market a little bit. And this is the golden age, I think, of gaming where people have any type of game they want to pick. So knowing what's out there will also help you. Playing other people's games helps you. I could not be a game designer if I didn't play games. There's just no way. Because then, to me, the rules would just be text, and I couldn't see them how they worked on the table, and that is when game design tends to suffer. So in terms of, like supplements and all of that, I am a big believer in planning long term. Some people don't. Some people just want to put out the one thing and go. I like to think about my 5-year plan. It's very challenging to do that in an unpredictable market, which is why once a quarter I try to think about, what I'm doing, where my deadlines are, where I'm going. That doesn't always work with reality because I am a human being with emotions and family and, everything else like that. But that is something that I try to do because if I know what I want to work on and what I want to do, I will subconsciously work towards that. And that has really helped me out quite a bit, just to help keep me focused. Because, if I didn't have to worry about money, I would just make art all day long. But then it would just be for me. And so that's part of the reason why I am trying to think about, who is going to buy this game, where I'm going to sell it, how much money, would I be comfortable with to feel that it's a success? Those are some important questions to ask yourself. Does anybody have any, are you thinking, do you want to talk about pricing or do we want to get into that? 5 minutes? Any other questions? We have 5 minutes. I threw a lot of information at you and you're all just like, wow. So, anybody? Pricing? Anything?
Yeah, just a quick one about overall percentages on art, freelancers. How do you divide your overall budget?
That's really tough. Art tends to sell books, but words are important to the game as well. It depends upon if you want a really art-centric book or not. If you want a really art-centric book, I would say 40-60, where, 40% of the art. There are a lot of companies, what they do is they say once every 4 pages, I will have a half-page art. I will have a full page in front of the chapters. Some game publishers, they say we'll do 1/8 page or 1/4 page. It really depends upon how many pieces you want, what size they are, and the frequency in which they appear. The best way to figure that out is to pick up games that you like and analyze that, actually count, and then figure out how many are in there, because that will tell you, and I can tell you right now what companies have huge budgets. Like Wizards, oh my God, they have a huge budget for the art. So that you will see a lot of more frequency of art pieces in a Wizards book than you might in a different smaller game designer's book. So I think that's very important. But it also depends upon the size, because the size, there's full page, then there's half page, then there's 1/4 page where you can divide the page into 4 pieces, and then there's 1/8 of a page where it's a smaller character. Small character profiles are usually 1/8 of a page. Larger character pictures where they are with a splat are usually half a page. They don't look like it because it's not in a box, but that's how they're built. So, any other questions? Yes?
Yes, I was wondering that if you want to like self-publish or use like crowdfunding,
yes.
or is it like, I can't say it's better, but is it like easier or than to try to get like these huge companies to buy?
I would not necessarily say it's easier. So when one of the things that's often missed is that when you self-publish, you are essentially setting up your own company and going into business for yourself. That's the difference. That sometimes for a lot of people is harder than just selling their game, because when you do that, especially through Kickstarter is work. I mean, because you have to come up with all of the art on the page, you have to come up with the updates, you have to communicate with the fans, you have to figure out the postage. It is its own job. And at this point, Kickstarter is also very good for marketing in a sense, because people get to check out your game. You're as an indie published or a self-published author, it is much better to have the book done before you take it to a crowdfunding, because then it's lower risk, but you're still a risk because you haven't published anything before, which is why it's really good to have, it's called proof of concept. So you have done the work, your game is done, maybe here's a text-based version of the rules or a beta or a preview so people can play around with your game and have some fun with it. All of these things help get people interested in your game. You're giving them a little bit so that they give you money. Backers feel very invested in crowdfunding. They feel they take part in it. It's an ownership thing for them, and there's a community around it. So checking out those different areas is great, but I would not say it's easier. In fact, I would say it's a lot more time intensive, because you are hustling basically to, I do not mean that in a con man sort of a way. I mean that in a, you're running. I mean, you're really working to try to get that interest and whatnot. But I think that's good for game designers overall, because that helps you put a face to the people that want to buy your game, which is really hugely important. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this as long as I have if I haven't met people that had fun with my games. Otherwise, why do it,
Yeah, the reason why I was asking was that for myself, because I don't have made anything before, so if I contact the Wizards and say, hey, I have this idea, do you want to?
Wizards will send you to, so what Wizards is doing right now is Wizards is sending people to DM's Guild. That's how they're finding freelancers. And they are not taking ideas. Most publishers will have submission guidelines on their website. Go to the publisher's website first and see whether or not they're taking pitches. You in the back? This will be the last question. Yes, you.
Yes. Do I need the mic or?
Well, just belt it, because I'm breaking the rules again and running out of time.
Just about playtesting. So
yes.
What point do you start playtesting, and how do you usually organize it? Because it usually goes on for a while.
Yes. So at what point do you start playtesting? Again, I think it's very important to have, this is what the players do at the table, and this is what the individual players do. I think having basic rules first is important, because when you playtest, you're going to want to playtest the basic rules, but then you're also going to start playtesting individual scenarios. So what happens if these characters break into the, apparently there's a LARP in a European Parliament, which is so cool. So say that in a tabletop game you were going to break into the European Parliament and you decided to come up with new rules on how that would affect your character politically. That would be a scenario that you would then put together. But you need to have basic rules before they can do that. I like to have surveys, and I like to have these things called cutoff dates. So for playtesters, I would suggest it's kind of in the middle of the road, but I would suggest 2 months, depending upon whether or not people have active playtest groups. If only because the most important thing about gaming is having the time to play. Some people like to cut that shorter and just have it be a month, or take it to a convention and then have a bunch of that's like the best way to playtest, right? You go up to a bunch of people like, hey, you like me, right? I'm awesome. Yeah, so I made this game, it's super cool, and would you help me please? And then what you do is you put the playtester names in your documents for the credits page. Big fan of credits pages. Credit is the free and cheapest thing that you will ever give someone, but they love it. And then you can give them also a digital version of the game as a thank you as well for the work that they do. Yep. So thank you I'm breaking the rules. So thank you so much for coming. This was so much fun. If you have questions afterwards, I'll be standing out in the hallway. I have had a lovely time at Ropecon, and I really appreciate every single one of you. So thank you very much.